Let's now start thinking about what will actually happen when we click on these numbers. There's some math logic that we need to come up with, and that's mostly JavaScript. But here's the thing. For every behavior you're trying to implement in a React application, there are two aspects to it. There's the actual logic for the behavior, and there's the UI logic to describe what this behavior is going to be changing. So when we click on a number, we're going to have to change that number's color based on its new state. We're going to have to do some math computations to figure out this new state, but we also have to reflect this new state change to the UI. And it's often easier to start by doing the UI logic first. However, to design your UI logic, you need to come up with what elements you need to place on the state. Because we want React to change the color of every number we click, we will have to maintain some containers of data on the state. If you remember the number statuses, we have candidate numbers, we have wrong numbers, we have used numbers, and we also have the list of available numbers. Which of these containers should we place on the state to enable us to describe all the possible states? And the general advice in React stateful components is that you should minimize the state. Don't place on the state anything that could be computed from the other things that you place on the state. For example, wrong numbers can be computed from candidate numbers because we have the count of stars and we could just sum the candidate numbers, and if the sum is greater than the count, then we have wrong numbers. So we shouldn't really place the wrong numbers on the state. Also, the list of used numbers and the list of available numbers are just the inverse of each other. If the number is used, it's not available. So we could just use one or the other. We could start a used numbers container as an empty array, and then every time we need to mark a number as used, push a new element to that array, or we could start the list of available numbers as all the numbers, and every time we need to mark a number as used, we remove number from the available numbers. I think having the available numbers on the state is a little bit more interesting than having the used numbers. So when you design your state elements, make sure they're enough to represent all the possible states, and also make sure they are the minimum to represent all the possible states. So let's make them official. I'll start with the available numbers here. We'll put them in constants, available numbers, and you also get a set available numbers from React's use state. And in here, you do use state, and you pass in the initial value. Now, the initial value of all available numbers is the full range. So we're going to come back to here and put the full range of the available numbers here. And similarly, the candidates in a constant, and you get set candidate nums. And in here, we use state, and the initial value for the candidate numbers could be just an empty array. But here's the interesting thing about the increment that we're doing. We don't really need to worry about the transactions on these candidate numbers and available numbers yet. We just need to come up with a UI to describe them. So we can just use mock values in here. Let's, for example, say that 2 and 3 are candidates. And let's say that we only have 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 as available, which means 6, 7, and 8, and 9 are used already. We can't play them anymore. So by using mock data like this, we get to focus on the UI description and not the transactions on the state. Okay, so now 2 and 3 needs to show up as candidates. They will be wrong candidates rendered as red if the number of stars is less than 5. And they will be blue candidates if the number of random stars is more than 5. And we know that 6, 7, 8, and 9 needs to show up as green, used, not available anymore. So the number component needs access to this data, both the available numbers and the candidate numbers, and actually the number of stars, to be able to render itself. So we need to pass some kind of data to the playNumber component. Let me put things on multiple lines. Let me also put the number component here on multiple lines. And now let's think about what kind of data we need to pass to the playNumber component to make it render itself. You could, for example, think about passing the state elements to each playNumber component. I could be passing the available numbers here and the candidate numbers and the stars to make a playNumber decide its own style. However, this is too much information for a single playNumber. A single play number doesn't care about all the available numbers. It doesn't care about all the candidate numbers. It only cares about whether itself is an available number, a candidate number, a used number, or a wrong number. So instead of available numbers, we could pass this play number component Boolean attributes. Like, for example, is it used? Is it a candidate? This is a little bit better than passing the whole information down to the play number component. You want a component props to be exact, only the data that's needed to render the component and nothing else. Because by passing more information than needed, the play number component would be re-rendering itself in a few cases unnecessarily. However, instead of passing multiple booleans about what status the play number is, we could just pass the status itself directly and pass just one value for the number component. And to do that in a readable way, maybe we can introduce a number status function and pass the number ID here, the actual number, and this function is going to return what status the number is using all the data that's available here in star match. So let's do that. We'll introduce a function, call it number status. This function takes in a number and it will return one of 4 values. The order of the conditions that we're going to write in this function actually matter, because if the number is used, it can't be a candidate or a wrong. So let's start with used. A number is used if it's not in the available numbers. So we could just have an if statement here and do a check on this available numbers array and say something like, if the number is not in the available numbers array, and in JavaScript we can just use the includes method on an array. So if available number includes number is false, the number is used. So we could just return used in here. Now, if the number is in the available number array, now we can check if it's a candidate. So is the number in the candidate nums array? And we can use similar check here. If number is in candidate, that means the number could be either a correct candidate or a wrong candidate. So we're going to return one of 2 values here. And finally, if the number is not used and it's not a candidate, it is an available number. So let's return available here just for consistency and so that we can look up the style from the theme. By having consistent status for each number, we can just look up the style of the number from this theme. So we've got available, used. Now we need to figure out wrong and candidate. Candidate means we're still playing, and wrong means we picked candidates, but they are wrong. So we need to compute a value now. Remember how we didn't place the wrong numbers on the state because we determined that this is something that we can compute? We need to do this computation now. So let's call this candidates are wrong. So the candidates are wrong when the sum of all the numbers in the candidate numbers array is greater than the count of stars. Now in the utils object, we have a way to sum an array. So we're just going to use that. So candidates are wrong when utils.sum for the candidate numbers, the whole array of candidate numbers, is greater than the count of stars. This makes all the current candidates wrong. So in here, in this condition, if the number is a candidate, then we're going to say, are the candidates wrong? And if they are wrong, then this candidate number has a status of wrong. And if the candidates are not wrong, then this candidate number is an actual candidate that needs to show up as blue. Okay, let's test this logic. We are passing a new status property here, and this status property is going to be computed from all the mock data that we placed on the state. So in the play number component, we need to introduce conditional styles based on this new status property. And we can use React's style object for this. Now the style we need here is really simple. We need to just change the background color of the number. So we do background color in here. And this background color is the value that we need to pick from the colors object. And since we have the number status here, this is just a direct lookup of the colors object. So the background of a play number is the value from colors that is associated with props.status, the new property that we just computed and passed to each number. This one. And we can test. And check it out. The numbers that are not available are showing up as selected. And the numbers that are candidates are showing up as blue here because we have 9 stars. And 2 plus 3 is still less than 9. If we render a case where 2 plus 3 is more than the number of stars, they are showing up as wrong. So what I just did here is complete UI logic. I didn't do any transactions on the state. I did not do any math to figure out if the number should go in the candidate numbers or if it should be removed from the available numbers. That's what we're going to do next. But just notice how I focused on what state elements to introduce and what changes in the UI description to do to make it honor these new state elements. And now that we're done testing this UI description, we can go back to the actual initial values that we need for each state element. We need empty array for the candidate nums, and we need the full list of numbers, and it's the exact same thing that we're using here to represent all the available numbers. So I can take this one here and make it the initial value for the available numbers. And the UI is rendering all the numbers as available, no candidates, regardless of the count of stars. The logic that we did here in the number status function, by the way, is not very important. This logic will depend on the application you're writing. The React concept that you need to appreciate here is how we've introduced elements on the state of this application, mocked the initial values of these elements, and changed our UI description, the function of our data, to honor these new elements. Now we're ready for the next step, which is to figure out how to transact on these new state elements to complete the story of this app. We'll do that next.